Hey everyone, so for today we're moving on to one of the other causes of the Civil War, which of course is maybe the most predominant cause, is the issue of slavery, the divide that slavery had between the northern states and the southern states, and the role that slavery played in leading the country to civil war. The issue of slavery is kind of one of the main underlying reasons of the Civil War. It's kind of summed up in this excerpt from a letter by Abraham Lincoln to his friend Alexander Stephens, who was a resident of Georgia. Lincoln is quoted in the letter as saying, "You think slavery is right and ought to be expanded, while we think it is wrong and ought to be restricted. That, I suppose, is the rub." So this kind of sums up the idea between the divide between what some people wanted for slavery and between the South and what people against slavery wanted. So the idea of expansion versus restriction. Of course, we have ideas, and there are ideas of what the South was like and what the Northerners were like. Are built into pop culture, such as movies as Gone with the Wind. The idea that the South is a land of plantations where evil masters abused their helpless slaves. Northerners went to war to free the slaves from bondage. This is kind of a popular image that has been promoted. However, in a lot of ways, some of these images are untrue. Planters are actually a minority in the South. Only 25% of Southerners own slaves, so 1 in 4. A majority of planters own less than 5 slaves. So you don't have these massive plantations. There were massive plantations, obviously. So, but only 0.75% owned 50 or more slaves. So less than 1% of slave owners owned 50 or more slaves, owned these massive plantations. So as we've learned, the vast majority of Southerners were actually subsistence farmers. They lived off the land. They had a small plot of land that they farmed to support themselves and their families. Actually, a smaller number of Southerners were squatters. They lived on other people's lands farming it. They actually didn't own the property. Slavery is a huge Southern institution, is a huge economic factor. In 1860, the 4.5 slaves that lived in the South were worth 3 times more than all the money in U.S. banks. Think about that for a second. Slaves are worth 3 times as much money that exists in the banks. There were 7 times the amount of money in circulation, so the amount of money being passed between people. Their slaves are worth 7 times that, and 48 times the amount that the government spent that year. That is insane when you really think about that. What a major economic aspect owning people in the South was. Slavery was also the Southern way of life. It was intertwined with the rural lifestyle and the values. It often defined their social classes. You had different classes from slaves, subsistence farmers, to small landowners with slaves, to large plantation owners, powerful people. The people who were the most powerful tended to own the most slaves in Southern society. The idea was really for a lot in the South was that to take away the slavery was to destroy the South. So the Virginia Convention actually changed its vote in April of 1861 and seceded from the Union because they assumed that Lincoln intended to eradicate their lifestyle. They originally did not want to secede in Virginia. They didn't want to have a war. They didn't want to deal with that. But when Lincoln raised an army, they thought, hey, Lincoln's coming. The federal government's coming to take away our slaves. We have to fight. So really, that is the idea in the South. So you can see that in two subsistence farmers here, William Ashton and John Sharp. These were subsistence farmers in far southwest Virginia. They lived off the land, had small plant. They actually voted against secession in 1861. They thought the immediate secession of Virginia is immediate war, which will bring ruin to her. However, like a lot of people, they changed their vote when Lincoln raised an army. So they thought that seceding from the Union was going to cause war that would destroy Virginia. But when they knew that Lincoln was raising an army, they thought that the federal government, the Union, was going to come in and take their way of life. So they decided to secede. Southern view of slaves was really as property. 95% of African Americans lived in the South. So there was only 5% of African Americans lived in the North. A majority of these African Americans were slaves. And as we saw how important they were, how much they were worth, slavery was an economic issue for many people in the South. It was their way of life. It was actually ruled that slaves are not people. This was actually ruled by the Supreme Court of the United States in the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was a slave who escaped his master and was later captured and returned to his master. And the case went all the way to Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that slaves were, quote, so far inferior that they have no rights which the white man is bound to respect. Let that sink in for a quick second. They have no rights which the white man is bound to expect. They are not even considered people. They're simply property. It's repulsive to think about from our viewpoint today. We can't even imagine it, but that's how even the Supreme Court of the United States looked at it at this time. It has changed so drastically in our time, and for the better. We have to see this as moral progress. But at the time, it was historically acceptable. 12 presidents before the Civil War had owned slaves. Some of our most famous figures, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, owned massive amounts of slaves. We learned about how many slaves Andrew Jackson owned. It was a way of life for many of these people. Again, not acceptable, but at the time, it was seen as historically acceptable. Slavery is also seen in the Bible. There is a quote in the Bible that says, "Slaves, obey your masters, serve them as you would serve Christ." So a lot of Southerners, being Christians, would find their justification for slavery in the Bible. People also argued that slavery was better than working in the factories or mines in the North. You can see here child labor. The idea of this was that this is wage slavery, that these people were stuck earning a small wage, but their lives were terrible. They were stuck in factories. The argument was that masters cared about their property, whereas Northern business owners abused their workers who were paid by the hours. The idea was that masters would actually take care of the slave families, take care of them, but they were still property. So there was that argument to be made that they were actually treated better in certain ways than the Northern worker. However, there were a series of slave revolts. Slaves were revolting against the institution, and these slave revolts forced Southerners to confront the institution. Gabriel Prosser was a literate enslaved blacksmith who planned a large rebellion in the Richmond area, the Richmond, Virginia, in the summer of 1800. This rebellion was quickly quelled, but he was planning to have a huge uprising. Nat Turner's rebellion was actually a larger rebellion that took place in Southampton, Virginia, in August 1831. These rebel slaves killed 55 to 65 people. At least 51 of them were white. So Southerners had committed themselves to slavery and rigidly controlled African Americans. But these slaves often, these rebellions are showing that this is not a perfect system. They are rebelling against this system. So what our Southerners are forced to do is control it even more. So here, a depiction of the horrid massacre in Virginia of Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 when he killed, when these rebel slaves attacked. You can see the slaves attacking the white people here. So this horrified people in the South, made them seem that they had to defend it more. But from the other side of the perspective, from our modern perspective, you can see the slaves are overrunning their oppressors. They're attacking the people. So from our perspective, it is justified today. Southerners defended slavery. There were harsh laws in place against people who aided fugitive slaves. If you aided a slave who escaped, you would be put in jail. There was a gag rule, which actually stopped the National Congress from talking about abolishing slavery. Southern states would not allow it to even be brought up in Congress, the idea of abolishing slavery. So they were defending the institution.
So this idea as we move to the Civil War that the North was some kind of savior, was some kind of anti-racist place, simply isn't true. Most Northerners actually supported slavery. They just didn't need it in their society. A lot of Northerners thought of it as necessary and acceptable, that it was producing the raw goods that they needed for their factories. Most Northerners had little contact with African Americans, and it's only 1% of the African American population of the United States lived in the North. And when indirectly relied on slavery for textiles, it made up about 50% of Northern exports. They used this in their factories, so oftentimes they thought that slavery was necessary. Areas in the North, areas in the Free State were also plain racist. Many areas stripped freemen and former slaves of their right to vote. Ohio, Illinois, Oregon, and other states outlawed African Americans from living within their borders. So said, you might be considered free here, but you can't live here.
I think the Northerners were afraid of, though, was the expansion of slavery into new territory. They accepted the idea of slavery in the Southeast, but they did not want to see it extend into the North and West, as we saw that westward expansion. The big conflict was the idea of whether these states were going to be slave states or not. And a lot of this was based on the worry about their jobs. Slave labor is free. you own something, it's way cheaper to have slaves than it is to pay people. So they were worried that as slavery expanded, it could take away their jobs. And this is where you get the idea of the Free Soilers. The Free Soil Party was a short-lived political party that actually ran for presidential elections in 1848 and 1852. And their sole idea was the idea against the expansion of slavery. They wanted free soil and free men. They did not want to see slavery move into other territory. There's backlash against those who did support abolitionists, did support freedom. So if you look at Elijah Lovejoy, a story of him, he was a pastor, newspaper editor, and abolitionist in Alton, Illinois. A mob actually burned down his house, destroyed his printing press, and murdered him simply for supporting the idea of abolition, for supporting the freedom of slaves. People did not support this. People were racist, thought it was a fair institution. So they would backlash against people who did support it. There were many more people like Lovejoy. Abolitionists were the people who attacked the institution of slavery. Some Northerners were abolitionists who wanted to eliminate slavery. And the basic argument for that is slavery is immoral. We know that today. Without a doubt, we know that slavery is an immoral practice. Owning another human being is unacceptable in any bounds. But as we see, there were a lot of justifications for it back then, their perspective. But the abolitionists in the North were starting to argue this moral point and saying that this is immoral. Garnet was one of these people. He's quoted saying, "Neither God nor angels command you to suffer for a single moment. It is your solemn duty to use every means to free yourself. There is no hope of freedom without the shedding of blood. Brethren, arise, arise. Strike for your lives and liberties. Now is the day and the hour. Let every slave throughout the land do this, and the days of slavery are numbered. You must strike down your oppressors." What Garnet is calling for here is all slaves rise up. Throw down your oppressors. Be free. This is an unjust institution. It must be overturned. Great abolitionist and former slave Frederick Douglass is quoted saying, "I urge you to fly to arms and smite to death the power that would bury your liberty. Rise up in arms, push down the oppressor. They take away your liberty." Douglass became one of the most famous abolitionists, meeting with Lincoln and spreading the word of the abolitionist movement, the freedom of slaves. And you can see that in his quote here. Probably the most famous work of abolitionist propaganda, of abolitionist ideas, was the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was published in 1852. It was written by Harry Beecher Stowe, who was from Connecticut, and it sold 1.5 million copies in its first year. And basically told the story of an oppressed slave, and basically kind of illustrated the ideas of what was happening to these people in the South. So this really kind of had spread the idea throughout the country and really spread the abolitionist idea. So in a lot of ways, this can be looked as a book that helped lay the groundwork for the Civil War. Important abolitionist was William Lloyd Garrison. He published the Liberator newspaper. He was a resident of Massachusetts, published this newspaper in the North, basically spreading ideas of abolitionists and saying that basically slavery should be abolished. He stated that slavery violated Christian principles. So where you could find that passage in the Bible, he's saying that overall the Christian principles are violated by the institution of slavery. And so he's quoted as saying, "I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." So Garrison's really important for getting the word out about abolition, to spreading this newspaper, the Liberator newspaper. The Liberator depicted the horrible scenes that were true that you see here. You see, this is a picture published of a slave ship throwing 6 slaves into the ocean. The horrible scene of just murdering people as property. So this helped to spread the idea to a lot of people in the North and throughout the country. Another picture that was published in the Liberator, the idea of a slave auction. You look at these people here, these people, mothers with their children being sold off at an auction, like a piece of property, like they were considered, being separated. It's horrific. And these images really kind of help settle in to a lot of people's mind that there's something wrong with this. This is not a just and justifiable institution. If you look at this is an advertisement that was taken from the South and published in the Liberator, showing how absurd this is. We look at this now, and this is just, it's shocking to look at. But look at the cost for different slaves. $3 for an age 20 to 26, strong, able-bodied. You can get $1 for an age 52, good colonel man. I mean, these are seen as property, and to see this published, you're like, this is shocking. These are human beings. So this really kind of starts to turn the idea in the North. A lot of people are being like, there's something wrong with this institution. This is not just. Also, things like these institutions, bells and horns were used for slaves who were runaways. So if you got caught trying to run away, you can see these horrible depictions. They put bells chained around your head so they could hear you, or horns so you get snagged on things. You also couldn't sleep with that on this punishment. I mean, these are human beings. It's hard to even look at these pictures today and think about this, but they justify this in the South as these are property. So as you start to see this and these things start to be published in the North, you start to get an idea of why there's such a strong movement towards abolitionism. It's horrible to imagine the idea of children as slaves. Today we think children should play, should go to school, go to kindergarten. The idea that a child can be someone's property is pretty shocking. And so this is another thing that we move towards, moral progress. It's another picture that would have been displayed in the Liberator. This punishment, the whipping of slaves for disobeying their masters. While this often wasn't common for a lot of slaves, this did happen in a lot of areas, and it's horrible. The punishment and the treatment of other human beings as slaves. There really is a confrontation that is building between the North and South, between the free states and the slave-owning states. There's the fear of slavery expanding. There's the fear that slave states are getting more power. And so there's a compromise known as the Compromise of 1850, in which the Fugitive Slave Act is passed. And the act is kind of one of the more controversial areas, and it heightened the northern fears of a slave power conspiracy. But it required that all escaped slaves, upon capture, be returned to their masters, and that officials and citizens of free states had to cooperate. Abolitionists actually nicknamed this the Bloodhound Law for the dogs that were used to track down runaway slaves. So this is saying if a slave leaves a southern state and makes its way to a northern state, Northerners have to help capture that slave and bring them back to their owners in the South. See something like this, the Underground Railroad. Remember Harriet Tubman, the story we heard, helping runaway slaves to get to free lands. People with the Fugitive Slave Act, this was seen as being a criminal act. Today we see this as a heroic act, freeing people, helping them get away from the oppression act. But to a lot of people in the South and the North, in the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, this would be seen as criminal.
John Brown was a violent abolitionist. He led uprisings during the Bleeding Kansas conflict, and actually led a group of men who hacked Southerners to death, attacked them with knives and axes. He also led an armed attack on a weapons depot at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown hoped to arm slaves, trigger rebellion, and create a new country for freemen and African Americans. However, he was captured and put to death following the attack at Harper's Ferry. But what this showed was that people in the country were willing to have violent opposition to slavery, violent opposition to the state of slavery.
What I want to end on here is the idea that there was mass confusion. And there's like both sides don't really understand each other, especially over the idea of slavery. So Northerners believed that Southerners intended to spread slavery throughout the country. They thought that they were going to try to get slave states in other areas in the West, that they were going to try to use their power to spread slavery throughout. And Southerners were convinced that Lincoln and the rest of the North intended to abolish slavery as part of a broad plan to eliminate their way of life. Southerners believed that Northerners were coming in to steal their way of life, to take their property, to take their values, to take the way they had built their society. So you could see this confusion between the two sides. And this would, obviously reach a breaking point with the Civil War.